The Youth Participation Practice Network is very excited to support the release of the brand new Wayipunga resource. We have Indi Clarke from the Koorie Youth Council here today to give us an introduction to the brand new resource, talk us through a little bit about how it came to be, how to use it, and why it's so important for the youth sector. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Indi to introduce herself and get us up the way. Thanks, Indi.
Deadly. Thanks, Sam, and good to see everybody. Before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge country and pay my respects to the lands on which I'm meeting from here today. And that's the Wurundjeri people. I acknowledge their elders, past and present, but also extend that acknowledgement to all of the country and the peoples on whose land you're meeting from as well. Acknowledge their customs, their law, their traditions that have kept this country healthy and strong for over 80,000 years. And emphasise that by saying when we place First Nations knowledge systems at the heart of what we do here, may we continue to exist for another 80,000 plus years. But that comes with a redefining of our relationship and reshifting our way of being, which is what we're going to talk a bit about today in terms of First Nations youth participation, or Aboriginal youth participation, if we've been talking about it at KYC. So I've got a little presentation I've put together. Before I start yarning, I want to quickly just highlight that I still have brain fog. I had COVID the other week. So there might be parts here where I'm kind of searching for a word. Be patient with me. I do have a presentation. I've just chucked this together. This was going to be Bryce Taylor, our Deadly Youth Participation Coordinator, who was going to be delivering this, but he's enjoying some much needed leave and has taken off back up to Queensland, where he grew up on Koorie country. So he's enjoying the sun while we're all here in the cold in Victoria. So power to him. But I'll share my screen. Go. Can you see that? Can someone say yes? Because I can't see anybody.
Yes.
Lee. All right. So I guess just the pretense, this Deadly work and what it's about is that obviously for the Koorie Youth Council, for those who don't know, we're the representative body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people here in Victoria. We're guided by an executive of 15 deadly young people, and by doing so, we value the diversity and strength of young people as decision makers, and we advocate the government community to advance the rights and representation of young mob. And it's really important. We've got nearly a 20-year history. We were established in 2003 out of ATSIC, for importance around having a voice and making sure that the rights and representation of young people were being heard at all levels, and in particular in public policy. And when we think about it for the Aboriginal community in particular, over 50% of our population is under the age of 25. So quite different to the Western population. Our community is quite young. And so it's really important that we're taking into consideration young people's views and aspirations in all that we do. I just want to talk to that. To set it up, we always have a saying at KYC, and I'll talk more around youth participation soon, but what it should be grounded in is what we have a saying at KYC called the wheel is life. And so when we say that, what we're referring to is the Aboriginal social emotional wellbeing framework. And what this contextualizes and looks at is our social emotional wellbeing. So in a Western metric of social emotional wellbeing, it's normally your connection to your physical wellbeing and your mental wellbeing, and you're fine, right? But in reality, that's actually an alien concept when it comes to Aboriginal people and First Nations people. For us to feel holistically well, we need our connection to our physical and mental well-being, our family, our kinship, our community, our culture, our land, and our spirituality and ancestors. And when you think about what's happened since colonisation and invasion, you think about the 230 years, what has happened in this country, it gives you a greater understanding for the successes of our community and where you see good practice and our mob connecting to culture and that. But also gives you a greater understanding for some of the challenges that our community exists in. When you think about stolen generations, you think about the dispossession, and displacement and disbursement of our community, you get a greater appreciation for some of the challenges our communities do face, and how when we work from this model and any programs working with young people centre this as a framework, we start to see the true understanding of young people really enjoying programs and participating fully. But one thing I like to always highlight is that whilst this is always happening as well, there's the determinants that continue to influence and affect our young mob and anyone really in our community. And that's the social determinants, political determinants, historical determinants, and the cultural determinants. Now, there's one date at the start of the year we can think about and which comes to fruition, and every time it comes up to that date, you can, if you know mob, it's quite an exhausting time normally. They might be flat, and it's because all of these come into play. All of these may be questioned, all of these may be kind of thought about, or you have to justify. Does anyone want to take a stab at what date that might be? Feel free to just jump in.
That'd be the 26th of January,
yep.
I reckon.
Exactly. So put it into context, that's one date of a year where all of this comes into play, and you think about young mob and pretty much their social emotional well-being. Now you put that in the context of every single day, you think about going to school, you think about work, you think about all of those things. It shows you, and once again, contextualize for what a young person goes through every day and for them to feel holistically well. So if we're youth workers, anyone working in the space, it is absolutely important that we know this wheel, that we underpin our work in this, and anything that we're doing is really from this line of work. Now, I'm not just saying this it's not just a framework that we've put together. This is researched and developed by an incredible group of Aboriginal psychologists. So it's actually created out of the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association, which is Dr. Graham G, Annie Pat Dudgeon, Dr. Clinton Schultz, Angela Hart, and Claire Kelly, an incredible group that came up with this. And then we kind of re-illustrated it for Nuggetji when we did it, just to make it a bit more youth-friendly, I guess, for our website. I'm going to stop sharing for 2 seconds for the next question. Oh, I can't see this. I can. Just a way of reacting, if you can. How many people have seen that in this group before? Yeah, cool. Andy, I see you there, brother. Good to see you. Yeah, so I think that's really important, because I always ask that question, no matter where we go, and it's where it shows where we need to get to. No matter where I go, I'll be lucky if 50% have seen that framework before. And it just shows you where we need to get to and where that needs to be underpinning all your work if you're working with young mob. At least if you don't underpin it, at least you've got the context and knowing and the knowledge to understand what our young people are going through on a daily basis. I think it's really important, and as you'll see with the next bit that I'll start to talk about, it's even more important as we start to step into youth participation, because it's the social context, it's the cultural context, and it's connecting on that deeper level. Let me go back to my screen now. All right, so what I'm here for, though, is to talk about an incredible resource that we've been working on for a long time now. It comes from young people, it comes from our organisation understanding the space in which we exist within, and it comes from the practice of what we believe is 80,000 years of practice as well. What this incredible resource is titled is Wayipunga, and you heard Sam talk to that before, and what it stands for in the Dja Dja Wurrung language is supporting young people. And that's what this framework sets out to do. But more important, I just want to highlight in particular that when we walk on Kulin country, or any one of the Kulin nations country, the creator spirit Bunjil asks two things of us, and I say this as a Bunurong man and as a man that's walked and lived on this country for quite a while now. But one of the really beautiful parts of when we walk on this country, and you'll hear it when you hear our elders, whether it's from Wurundjeri or even Bunurong, they talk about Bunjil's law, and Bunjil's law sets out two things. One is that we care for the land and the waterways, and the other is that we care for the children and young people. So when we think about youth participation, when we think about the work in which even KYC stands for, it's continuing the practice and the law that's existed on this country for over 80,000 years. But somehow we've watched, once again, over 230 years, the systemic pressures, failed policies, past policies, and even current policies, and how they've created such barriers to youth participation and to genuine and meaningful engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young mob in a way that truly shines and gives them agency. And so what we did is we set out to really understand what were the barriers and what were the enablers to, when you think about youth participation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, and what they see as kind of the key parts that would start to do. And when we started this work, we thought about developing a set of tools and strategies, and that would be it. And when we started doing the yarns and started going out and talking to youth workers and talking to young people, what we realised was that to an extent, the baseline knowledge on Aboriginal youth participation, if we had have just created a set of strategies and tools, we would have been perpetuating the issues that were existing. And it showed that we really needed to set out a framework and set out and create a tangible resource in which supports anyone that's wanting to work with young people, how you genuinely and meaningfully practice Aboriginal youth participation and not perpetuate the issues that do exist and tokenise and continue to pretty much create further barriers or pretty much give young people experiences that don't genuinely support their participation or push them away from the systems. And we're seeing that time and time again, but we have seen great practice as well. And so I think that's where this has really set it out. So what we've come to understand is that, as we know, and you all practice and do this work, so I'm not going to talk about the youth participation too much, in the sense that we know that it's genuine and meaningful engagement of young people where we recognise, see them and celebrate them as decision makers, and that our structures and policies truly embed and support them to have agency. And in a cultural context, we need to be able to do that as well. So very much recognising that there's a lot of work that's done in youth participation, there's a lot of research, but there was never really much done with an Aboriginal context or a cultural context. It was always mainstream. And as we know, mainstream is not always the space for mob, because are they accessible? Are they culturally safe? Are there a place in which truly celebrates First Nations knowledge? Or is it a place where First Nations young people and our young mob go and feel like they're othered, or they feel like they have to justify who they are? And so for us, when we did this, we started to look at two parts. What we see was part of the issues and part of the perpetuation that we started to see was that a lot of organisations weren't, and I say this not bad-mouthing orgs or anything, but what we were finding was, due to policies, due to procedures, a lot of organisations were perpetuating issues of just running and ticking boxes. They didn't want to work with young people for genuine and meaningful reasons. It was because the organisation had this need and they were fixing that need rather than actually genuinely and meaningfully working with the young people. And so what we've looked at is that what we started to find with a lot of the barriers were, when practice was happening, it was just people wanting to rush to do the actions. They might not have had the knowledge, and a lot of the time the value wasn't there. And so for KYC and for what we've set out is that this framework is interrelated. And when you go to the website, which I'll chuck in the chat, I'll get Sam to chuck in the chat, is when you work through every single one of these, under each one, it's grounded in young people's knowledge. It's grounded in youth workers' knowledge as well, around what they see as the barriers, what they see as the enablers, and all of this in quotes around what their visions are, even in some of them. So to set it up, what we understood was that for true and genuine meaningful practice in an Aboriginal context, you actually have to have a set of values. And the values are that you truly value young people's participation, that you value Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, families and communities, and that you value self-determination. And in that context, understanding and really deeply starting to unpack what that means for you as an individual, as an organisation, and even in your own policies and procedures. Because too often we see a lot of people running to the actions, but in an Aboriginal perspective and in a cultural perspective, we're a values-driven community. We connect off connection, we connect off ethics, really. We connect off place, we connect off space, and that genuine and deep connection. And Auntie Mary Graham has written a really incredible paper that's even backed this in academia, but it's really grounded in our way of being. And so if you want to work with young mob, it's reflecting and understanding that. Then from the values, when you start to reflect on those, then comes the knowledge. So knowledge of historical context, reflecting and understanding what that looks like in the context of the community you're working with, not only the history of kind of colonization or the Aboriginal community's history there, but even history of programs. Are you reinventing the wheel? Are you trying to do something that's existed before? Or are you kind of building something that might not even work? Strong connections, making sure you have strong connections to the community, the ACOs, the organisations in the area. Genuine and meaningful engagement. We have a saying that young people, and we know this, young people have a bullshit radar like none. They know when you're not there genuinely, and they'll read it 100%. The same is said for the community, if not stronger with the community or our community. If you're not genuine and meaningful, you've already lost them in the first 10 minutes. So making sure that genuine and meaningful engagement and practice is done. You all know about the social context, so understanding what our young mob exists within, what life they exist within. And Brycey says something really deadly. It's looking at the colonial loads that exist with young people, right? When we think about an Aboriginal context, there's also pressures and things that are relied on for our young people that are being imposed by colonial structures, not by a cultural structure, because the cultural essence of who we are and our being is the strength and the beauty of it, but the things that have been placed on us since colonial times creates load. So it's really understanding the social context in which our young mob exist within, social media, all of those things. And then decolonization, challenging the accepted norms. When people hear that, they kind of jerk at first and kind of wonder why we're saying that. But what we really want you to do in this context is challenge the accepted norms. Challenge your spaces in which, practice has been this way for 50 years, so we're just going to continue to do that. Because that can't be the continued practice if we want to grow, if we want to learn, we want to truly support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people's agency. Because the reality of a lot of spaces weren't built for us. So decolonisation is, in this context, challenging those accepted norms. That, your policy might say that you have to do this program this way because it says so, which might remove your partnership processes with maybe the ACO in the area, or actually developing up a youth advisory group that drives a program. But we actually be, as Georgie Ferrari used to say, that the old CEO of Yakvik, pain in the arse, where you're a passionate advocate and you're challenging those accepted norms, because to work with our mob, we need to be doing that daily. And then from there, once you've got those knowledges, then we go on to actions. This is the difference, though. It's understanding the uniqueness of the values we must have, the knowledge that we have to be committed to obtaining or have obtained, then we can go do the actions. Then it looks like continual learning, how are we continually practicing and learning and growing. We have that saying at KYC, we've got to learn and grow always. How do we embed knowledge systems and build the partnerships in communities? Cultural safety. Cultural safety is a must, and it is a continual practice. People, and what we can sometimes find is that organisations do cultural awareness training, and that has created cultural safety. We challenge that cultural safety as the continual practice and partnership process of working with Aboriginal communities, and it's continually reflecting and making sure that your practices are aligned with what young people and our mob see, feel, do on a daily space. Challenging the barriers that exist and increasing accessibility. How are we making sure that we're really looking at those two in tandem and making sure that young people aren't facing any barriers coming, that accessibility in all forms is there, that our spaces really provide and support our communities and our young people to be there as well. We see a lot of that sometimes as well. Even some of the yarns, I remember accessibility, it might not have been directly around a young person, but even their nan, you know, who's a big part of their support structure, but space is not being accessible for them and their nan. So really looking at how we challenge the spaces in which we want to hold our programs. And then finally, celebrating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. This shouldn't be something that I just celebrate and First Nations people celebrate, but everyone should be celebrating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. We live in a country where our culture is the oldest living and thriving culture in the world. 80,000 years wasn't a coincidence. It's through a deep knowledge, an incredible governance system, ecosystems, and a practice that kept this place healthy for over 80,000 years. And when I think about it, this is what we love to celebrate and talk about at KYC and really nurture and communicate a lot, is that we're one of 2,500 generations. And that's something to be proud of, because when you think about that, you know, we place a lot of emphasis on spaces and beliefs and systems that haven't existed for 2,500 generations. We normally shun and push First Nations culture to the side, whether we should be celebrating all of those. And we really see that with young people. And so this framework really interrelates and interconnects, and it's a framework in which we believe is quite accessible. And I'm keen to take some questions at the end. We can have a bit of a yarn if we've got time. But I just wanted to kind of do a bit of introductory session to this. You can all go to the resource and read it in depth. It's a really great resource that I think is grounded in young people's knowledge, it's grounded in communities' knowledge, and it's grounded in our experiences as well, and what we see, feel, and do on a daily basis, and what we kind of see as the issues. But what it shows is that to work with our young mob, we need to be deeply committed. We can't no longer just continue the practice that's been for 30,000 years, for 30 years. We can't just continue to kind of believe that, you know, it's been this way forever. You know, we've just got to tick the box and get young people engaged. We've got to really actually shake that up and look to transformative change. What practices are we doing? How is it actually truly empowering young people? How are young people getting the spaces out of this? And in particular, how are we truly building? And you've just talked about co-design. Co-design is a good word, but if it's practiced genuinely and meaningfully, I think what we've found sometimes in our community is that co-design in essence is good, but on whose terms of reference are you doing the co-design? I think that's really important, and what we need to think about when we think about Aboriginal youth participation. Are you operating on your organisation's terms of reference, or are you willing to actually create a shared terms of reference with the community and with the young people? And that's really important when we think about Aboriginal youth participation, and remembering that it's a practice that has existed here for 80,000 years. It's Bunjil's law that we care for children and young people, and that we set out to walk with our young mob, not for them, but with them. So that sometimes when they take 2 steps back, we're there to take 3 steps forward with them. When you go through too, you'll see some incredible illustrations like this, which were created by Nikaya Cad, who is an incredible executive of ours, and actually is a proud Jar Jar Wurrung woman, among with a few other different mobs, including Gunditj Mara. But it's grounded in, we gave her pretty much the framework and talked about the different areas, and she went off and created the different illustrations and what she kind of connected them to with each section. So I think you really come to see, but this is what we stand for as young people, obviously participating and genuinely happy and healthy and thriving in these spaces, and which supports their agency. And then this is just an illustration that comes from Nuggegy, another deadly resource and bit of work we did in the YJ space, but I think it's definitely connected to what Wayipunga stands for. And so on the left here, you've got a kind of drought-ridden river that's kind of obviously not flourishing. And on the right, you've got the really flourishing and deadly kind of river with the trees and everything. So what it illustrates to me, though, is if we continue to perpetuate and believe stereotypical beliefs and kind of follow common youth participation practices that doesn't champion and support Aboriginal youth participation, or when we practice Aboriginal youth participation and when we really truly embed our work in Wayipunga, this is what it stands for, because it's the if question versus the when. The if is what we could have done and if we did it, and the when is when we practice, when we walk with. And I think this quote here in particular, when you connect me with my culture, country and community, I know who I am, I heal, I grow, I thrive. It's what we stand for here. I think I might leave it there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Indi, for stepping in at short notice and being so generous with your time, your knowledge and your experience. It's been a privilege for me to see this resource come together in the time that I've been at YACVIC. I know it's been a long time in the making, and I know that there's been a lot of twists and turns in the development of it, the way that you've approached it, the way that you've presented it. And it's just so incredible to see it coming together in such a complete way, a way that is driven by that knowledge system through those values that are so important to KYC and to culture. There's a couple of questions that have come through, or comments as well, that have come through in the chat box. One was about the academic paper. You were talking about an academic paper in the social context section, and a couple of us missed who you were referencing at that point. Can you remember who it was that you were talking to?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly what the paper's called because I got brain fog and it's real, but it's Auntie Mary Graham, who's an incredible elder from the Queensland area and has done a lot of work around this space in terms of ethics and place and the Aboriginal kind of terms of reference that I kept referencing before.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. A couple of lovely comments from Dan and from Michelle about the power of the work. Michelle particularly says how she thinks it really is relevant for all Australians, not just those working with children and young people. This is, you've taken an approach that really informs and educates your audience in a way that I don't think you necessarily thought was going to happen when you started it out. And it's, yeah, incredible to see the amount of work that's gone into it, the depth that's gone into your thinking, and the generosity with that information.
Can I extend on that, Sam, and ask Indi? I'll try and turn it into a question for you, Indi, if I can. Because obviously Bryce has shown me some of this stuff. Is it deliberate that in some ways, by drawing on Indigenous knowledge systems and saying this is how we're going to present it, to me, the more I've been looking at it, the more I've been going, this actually, okay, yes, it's about, Koorie youth participation, but could this framework really just be used as a participation framework, like for everyone? That is saying, here is an Indigenous way of thinking about this, and no matter who you are or where you are, this still can apply to.
Yeah, I think 100%. I have a saying that First Nations knowledge systems isn't something that just benefits our mob, that the whole of society will benefit when we truly place an emphasis on understanding First Nations knowledge systems and the collective being that exists within how we work. When we come to, I get quite deep when I have a bit more time and can talk through this, but when we come to understand Western society, it's a very individualistic space, right? It operates from an individualistic terms of reference. The things that come through are status, power, currency, and those. But when you think about an Aboriginal terms of reference, we're only as healthy as our community. So it's about how do we take all of community with us, and that's some of the pressures that have existed. I talked about the 230 years since colonisation and invasion, and that's some of the issues and challenges that have existed, is that we've had a dominant structure placed and forced upon us that our mob and our people and our young people have struggled to find their way through that. And then if we even think about policies just in the last 20 years, there's things that have come in that have now made it harder for our community to engage and work in a way that used to be the standard practice. And that's what we came to find when we did a lot of the engagements in yarning circles. The amount of time that we heard, oh, this deadly program was running 10 years ago, but it stopped due to funding was one. Policies and how they had to work was exhausting, and it was just too hard. And so, I think we always say that our work is a call to action. It's a new way to think. It's reimagining how we work. But in particular, there was a daily question that talked about it, and I should have said this in it, that very much we recognise that we can't just put it out there and say, everyone go do this. There is a training component to it in the development. Brycey's working on that. So there is a email that I'll send to Sam, which is our Wayipunga email, where you can send any inquiries through to, and we can come back. But the goal is very much to have a training component a part of this, because exactly that, if you want to work in this space, how do you start to really derive your programs and spaces from this, and really underpin what Wayipunga stands for?
Amazing. Thank you very much, Indi. I'm conscious of honouring your time. I really appreciate you stepping in at short notice. I think we might wrap it up there by thanking Indi again for his time. Finn, you can hit stop.